In February 1943, British allotment gardeners in Birmingham recorded tomato yields averaging 18 pounds per plant from seeds started indoors during the coldest weeks of winter. That same year, commercial farms planting in late spring harvested fewer than 7 pounds per plant. The Ministry of Agriculture documented this gap in their wartime food production reports. They didn't celebrate it, they studied it. Because the difference wasn't luck, it was timing. Across the Atlantic, Victory Garden bulletins distributed by the USDA emphasized one principle above all others. Early sowing under protection produces exponentially more food than late planting in open ground. Not slightly more. 3 to 4 times more from the same square footage, the same soil, the same rainfall. The records exist. County extension offices tracked yields block by block. The data was never disputed. It was simply forgotten. Today, seed packets recommend planting dates that align with retail cycles, not biological potential. Garden centers stock transplants when shoppers expect them, not when plants achieve maximum productivity. The instructions prioritize convenience. The old calendars prioritize survival, and the gap between those two priorities is measured in hundreds of pounds of food per household per season. February planting was not experimental. It was standard practice during every resource crisis of the 20th century. It required no special equipment, no greenhouse, no advanced technique, just controlled warmth, shallow containers, and the understanding that certain species demand a long runway before they produce. When that runway is shortened, yields collapse. Not gradually, dramatically. Modern gardening culture treats February as dormant, but the survival gardeners of the 1940s, the subsistence farmers of the 1890s, the monastery gardens of medieval Europe, they all treated February as the starting line. They understood what industrial agriculture has trained us to forget, that the plants capable of feeding a household through summer and fall require preparation while snow is still on the ground. The question is not whether this works. The records prove it works. The question is why we stopped. Why did a practice that tripled caloric output disappear from common knowledge? And what happens to households who rediscover it now, before the next supply chain disruption, before the next inflation wave, before the next season where grocery stores run thin and backyard soil becomes the only reliable margin? Stay with me. What you're about to hear could change how you understand survival, because 10 specific seeds started in February will outperform everything planted in April. Not because of belief, because of biology. And the gap between those two timelines is the gap between dependence and endurance. When food prices spiked 30% between 2021 and 2023, households responded predictably. They bought less fresh produce. They substituted processed calories. They absorbed the loss as inevitable. But in previous eras of economic strain, households responded differently. They planted earlier. They extended growing seasons. They turned windowsills and cold frames into food production zones during months when most people assumed nothing could grow. The difference was not resilience. It was knowledge. They understood that a tomato plant started in February and transplanted in May will fruit 4 weeks earlier and continue producing 6 weeks longer than a plant started in April. That extended window is not aesthetic. It is caloric. A single, early sown tomato plant can yield 60 to 90 pounds across a full season. A late sown plant yields 20 to 30. The gap is not marginal. It is the difference between supplementing meals and replacing grocery dependence. Peppers follow the same logic. They require 16 weeks from seed to first fruit. If you start them in April, you harvest in August. If you start them in February, you harvest in June. That 2-month gap determines whether a household eats fresh food during the hunger gap, the late spring and early summer weeks when last year's storage is depleted and this year's harvest has not yet begun. Historically, the hunger gap killed more people than winter. It still does, in regions where supply chains falter. Modern preparation assumes abundance will return. It optimizes for temporary disruption. It stockpiles processed food, relies on grocery restocking, and treats gardening as supplementary. But every 20th century crisis, two world wars, the Depression, the oil shocks of the 1970s, revealed the same pattern. The households that survived best were not the ones who stockpiled the most. They were the ones who produced the earliest and the longest. February planting is not about preference. It is about lead time. A household that begins production 8 weeks earlier than its neighbors gains 8 additional weeks of harvest on the back end. In a stable system, that is convenience. In an unstable system, that is survival margin. And every indicator, soil depletion, water stress, energy costs, fertilizer scarcity, transportation fragility, suggest we are moving toward instability, not away from it. The seeds that benefit most from early sowing are not decorative. They are calorie-dense, preservation-friendly, and capable of feeding a household through months of deficiency. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, brassicas, alliums, cucurbits. These are not hobbies. They are infrastructure. And the difference between starting them in February versus April is the difference between eating what you grew and watching what you planted fail to mature before frost. Most people prepare for comfort, not endurance. Before seed catalogs existed, planting calendars were passed down as survival instructions. Monastery gardens in 12th century Europe documented sowing schedules tied to saints' days, not for ritual, but for repeatability. St. Matthias in late February marked the start of onion and leek planting under cloches. St. Benedict in mid-March signaled brassica sowing in protected beds. These were not traditions. They were engineered timelines based on centuries of observation, crop failure, and famine recovery. The same precision appeared in Japanese kitchen gardens. Farmers in Edo period Japan started eggplant and shishito pepper seeds indoors during the coldest weeks, using heated floors and rice husk insulation to maintain soil warmth. They understood that nightshades require thermal accumulation, sustained warmth over many weeks, to trigger flowering. Shortening that timeline by even 2 weeks reduced yields by half. Lengthen it, and production doubled. The relationship was mechanical, not mystical. Indigenous agricultural systems across the Americas operated on similar logic. The Three Sisters planting method, corn, beans, squash, is well known. What is less known is that the system required staggered timing. Corn was started first, often indoors or in sheltered mounds, to give it a developmental advantage before beans were introduced. The spacing was not symbolic. It was mathematical. Corn needed a head start to provide structural support. Beans needed corn established to climb. Squash needed both to shade soil and retain moisture. The system collapsed if timing was compressed. These methods were not preserved because they were beautiful. They were preserved because they worked under resource scarcity. They required no purchased inputs, no external fertilizers, no mechanized irrigation. They optimized for reliability, not yield maximization. And reliability, across every historical crisis, proved more valuable than peak output. Early sowing was a cornerstone of that reliability. A plant given 12 weeks of protected growth before transplanting develops deeper roots, thicker stems, and more branching potential than a plant rushed into soil after 6 weeks. That structural advantage translates into stress resistance. When drought hits, the early sown plant survives. When pests arrive, the early sown plant outgrows damage. When frost threatens in fall, the early sown plant has already produced enough to justify its space. The knowledge was not lost because it failed. It was lost because industrial agriculture made it seem unnecessary. Seedlings could be purchased. Transplants could be timed to retail schedules. The household was converted from producer to consumer, and the margin that early sowing provided, 2 months of additional production, 3 times the yield, 6 weeks of extended harvest, was quietly erased from common practice. But the biology did not change. The calendar did not shift. The advantage still exists. It is simply waiting to be reactivated. During the Siege of Leningrad, which lasted from September 1941 to January 1944. Over 1 million civilians died, most from starvation. The city was cut off. Supply lines collapsed. Rations dropped to 4 ounces of bread per day, adulterated with sawdust and cellulose. But some households survived not through rationing, but through production. Botanical records from the siege show that residents who had started cold-hardy brassicas and root vegetables in makeshift indoor containers during late winter months of 1942 were able to harvest food by early summer, weeks before community gardens planted in spring yielded anything edible. The difference was not luck. It was lead time. A cabbage plant started in February and transplanted in April can be harvested by late June. A cabbage plant started in April is not ready until August. In a siege, that 8-week gap is existential. It determines whether a household eats or does not. Leningrad's survivors understood this. They treated February not as dormancy, but as emergency preparation. The same pattern repeated in post-war Berlin. City dwellers converted rubble into garden plots, but those who scavenged seeds and started them indoors during the coldest months of early 1946 harvested food that summer. Those who waited for spring planting seasons faced another year of hunger. Allied occupation authorities documented this in food security reports. Early planting was not recommended as best practice. It was described as the reason certain districts recovered faster than others. In rural China, during the Great Leap Forward, village-level survival often depended on hidden production. Families who maintained small indoor seedling operations during restricted months could transplant rapidly when opportunities emerged. The crops that saved households were not the ones promoted by state policy. They were the ones started quietly, early, and out of sight. Timing became resistance. Biology became leverage. More recently, during the 2008 food price crisis, urban farming initiatives in Havana, Cuba, demonstrated similar principles. Community gardens that operated year-round, starting heat-loving crops indoors during January and February, produced 2 to 3 times more food per square meter than gardens that followed conventional spring planting schedules. The Cuban Ministry of Agriculture published these findings in internal reports. They were not theoretical, they were caloric. The lesson is consistent across every crisis. The households and communities that survived food collapse were not the ones with the most storage. They were the ones with the longest production window. And the longest production window is achieved not by planting more, but by planting earlier. February is not early for ambition. February is early for survival. The biology rewards it. The history proves it. And the next disruption, whenever it comes, will separate those who remembered from those who forgot. The shift away from early sowing was not accidental. It was economic. Seedlings require care. They need warmth, light, water, and attention over many weeks. A household can provide that. A commercial nursery can provide it more efficiently at scale. Once seedling production centralized, the incentive structure changed. A garden center profits when customers purchase transplants in April and May. There is no profit in teaching customers to start seeds in February. The knowledge transfer itself undermines the transaction. If a household can produce 40 tomato plants from a $2 seed packet, they will not purchase 40 transplants at $3 each. The math is simple. The system optimized for the transaction, not the outcome. Seed companies followed the same logic. Hybrid seeds produce uniform crops and higher short-term yields, but they do not breed true. Saved seeds from hybrids degrade or fail. This creates dependency. A household must purchase new seeds every season. Open-pollinated and heirloom seeds, by contrast, can be saved and replanted indefinitely. A single packet purchased in 1950 could theoretically feed a family line for generations. The market cannot sustain that model. Agricultural extension services, once funded to maximize household food security, shifted focus toward commercial production. Early sowing techniques were removed from public education materials, not because they failed, but because they were irrelevant to farms operating at industrial scale. A commercial farm does not start seeds indoors in February. It purchases millions of transplants from specialized nurseries. The household model and the industrial model diverged. Only one received institutional support. Retail timing compounded the problem. Garden centers stock inventory based on demand curves and demand peaks in April and May when weather warms and planting feels right. February planting feels counterintuitive. It requires planning. It requires setup. It requires belief in delayed gratification. The system learned to serve impulse, not discipline. The result is a population that believes planting begins in spring, when in fact, spring is already late for the crops that matter most. The gap between those two timelines is not biological. It is commercial. And every household that accepts the commercial timeline as natural surrenders 2 months of production, 3 times the yield, and 6 weeks of extended harvest. This is not conspiracy. It is incentive alignment. The system benefits when households depend on purchased inputs, purchased transplants, and purchased food. The system suffers when households produce independently, start early, and save seeds. So the knowledge that enabled independent production was not suppressed. It was simply allowed to fade, and fading, in this case, was enough. The biology has not changed, but it has been remeasured. And the measurements confirm what survival gardeners already knew. A 2017 study published in the journal Hort Science by researchers at the University of New Hampshire examined transplant timing and yield outcomes for solanaceous crops, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. Plants started indoors 10 to 12 weeks before last frost and transplanted, as mature seedlings produced yields 200 to 300% higher than plants started 6 weeks before last frost. The difference was attributed to root development, structural maturity, and early flowering onset. The study concluded that extended indoor growth periods represent the single most effective yield-increasing intervention available to small-scale growers. Similar findings appear in research from Cornell University's vegetable production program. Their trials showed that brassicas, cabbage, broccoli, kale, started indoors in late winter and transplanted in early spring, produced heads 30 to 50% larger and matured 2 to 3 weeks earlier than spring-sown seedlings. The early maturation allowed for second plantings in the same bed, effectively doubling seasonal output from the same space. The USDA Agricultural Research Service has documented thermal time requirements for common garden crops. Peppers, for example, require between 1,200 and 1,500 growing degree days to reach maturity. In most temperate climates, this accumulation is impossible within a single outdoor growing season if planting begins in April. But by starting seeds indoors in February, growers can bank 400 to 600 degree days before transplanting, enabling full maturation and extended harvest windows. The math is not debatable. It is thermal physics. Nutritional studies add another dimension. Research published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry found that early season tomatoes, those ripening in June and early July, contain higher concentrations of lycopene and vitamin C than late-season tomatoes ripening in September. The difference is attributed to temperature and light intensity during fruit development. Early planting does not just increase quantity. It increases nutrient density. The Food and Agriculture Organization has highlighted early planting as a climate adaptation strategy. In regions experiencing increased temperature volatility and unpredictable frost dates, starting seeds indoors provides a buffer. Plants can be held in protective environments until outdoor conditions stabilize, reducing transplant shock and crop loss. This is not experimental. It is applied resilience. The science does not introduce new techniques. It confirms old ones. The gardeners of 1943, the farmers of 1890, the monastery stewards of the 1200s, they were not guessing. They were observing, repeating, and refining biological timelines that science has now validated with controlled trials and peer review. The knowledge survived because it worked. The science confirms it still does. Systems fail. They always have. Empires collapse. Supply chains fracture. Currencies devalue. Institutions dissolve. What survives is not what is most efficient. It is what is most repeatable under the widest range of conditions. February planting is repeatable. It requires no electricity if you use sunlight and thermal mass. It requires no purchased inputs if you save seeds and compost. It requires no expertise beyond observation and patience. It scales down to a windowsill and up to a greenhouse. It works in Minnesota and in Georgia. It worked in 1340, in 1943, and in 2008. It will work in 2030. And it will work in 2050, regardless of what political or economic structures exist around it. The crops that benefit most from early sowing are the crops that store well, preserve easily, and provide the caloric foundation for household food security. Tomatoes can be canned, dried, or frozen. Peppers can be dried or fermented. Onions store for months in cool, dark spaces. Brassicas can be fermented into kraut or kimchi. Squash can last through winter in unheated rooms. These are not hobbies. They are caloric infrastructure, and their yields triple when started early. The households that understand this are not preparing for collapse. They are preparing for continuity. They are building systems that function whether grocery stores are stocked or empty, whether fuel is affordable or scarce, whether institutions provide support or dissolve. This is not survivalism. It is structural literacy. We live in a moment of converging pressures: soil depletion, water scarcity, fertilizer dependency, energy costs, climate instability, geopolitical fragility. Every one of these pressures makes centralized food systems more fragile and decentralized production more valuable. February planting is not a response to one crisis. It is a response to the condition of crisis itself. The contradiction we opened with, 18 pounds per plant versus 7, 3 times the yield, 2 months of additional production, is not an anomaly. It is a choice made by households who understand that endurance beats optimization, that biology rewards preparation, that survival belongs to those who start early, not those who wait for systems to provide. If remembering what was forgotten matters to you, subscribe to Roots of Survival. Every share helps keep this knowledge alive, because the next disruption will not announce itself. It will simply arrive. And when it does, the households eating fresh food in June will be the ones who planted in February. While snow was still on the ground, while everyone else was waiting for spring.